Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. We're continuing going through the series Crash Course on the Bible. We're going through each of the books of the Bible to discuss the big themes, the highlights, the confusing parts. We're here to just discuss and provide some frameworks to help us read the scriptures. So today we're on our fourth book, and the fourth book is Numbers. So Jeremy, tell us, why are we talking math and not Bible today? What's going on with Numbers?
Yeah. Numbers is the Greek and Latin name for the book, and it's because the book is punctuated by two censuses that number all the people in the camp, one for one generation, one for another. And so for that reason, the Greek and Latin name is Numbers. The Hebrew name for the book is Bamidbar, which means literally in the wilderness. And so the Hebrew name for all the books of the Bible are the first words in that text. Um, so for Numbers, the first word in the book is in the wilderness, and then it tells the story of God's people in the wilderness on the way to the promised land. So whatever way you name the book, whether it's Numbers or in the wilderness, it's a book about God's people in transition. And you can really structure the book around those two censuses. The first one takes place in chapter 1, the second one in chapter 26, and they coincide with a transition from one generation to the next generation. So that's really a book about transitions, going either from one place to a new place, or from being one generation to another. It's just all about kind of liminality and transition from one to the next.
Yeah, no, that theme really resonates with me. I remember growing up learning about my Armenian heritage, like my parents being from, like my ancestors being from like Aintab, Eastern
Mm-hmm.
Turkey, and then
Mm-hmm.
my parents being from the Middle East, and then my parents from the Middle East to America. Like I grew up with the understanding that it was normal for people to leave where they're from to transition to somewhere else. So I
Right.
literally had this crazy thought when I was like 10. I'm like, I'm going to pick Australia when the time comes for me to leave.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that was like unspoken truth. Like my parents never said you're going to leave, but like
Right. Right.
I just assume that's what grown-ups do because of
Right.
the amount of transition as a diasporan people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
It
picked
works
Australia
into
because they
our.
speak English and there's awesome beaches, but
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. It's an easy transition. Yeah.
yeah.
Um. Yeah. It's worked into our cultural narrative that we move.
Yeah, yeah,
we
yeah.
we move on. We go from one place to the next. So yeah, that's interesting.
So the
Um.
transition here in Numbers is from Egypt to the Promised Land, and
Mm-hmm.
so you have the Numbers bracketing the in the wilderness just
Mm-hmm.
journey.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
like In the Wilderness better. I think that's a much better name than.
It's a cool name. And I think the word, or not the word, but the image for the wilderness is a very common like touchstone for people feeling like they're in transition.
Yeah.
Marginalized groups use that language of being in the wilderness, because it puts. And also, just as a side note, in the Bible, when we talk about the wilderness, it's not like, the rainforest. It's like
Desert.
dry, empty desert land. Like think Saudi Arabia, like this is what the wilderness is. So, we could probably be even more precise and call it like the desert. And so when you're in the desert, I heard it phrased this way, that in the Bible, the wilderness or the desert is the place where there aren't any sustainable life options except trust in God. So that's kind of the whole book laid out. The only sustainable life option is to trust in God's provisions, and throughout there's this ongoing theme of sort of doubting God and not allowing for His provisions to be good enough, and then it sort of falls apart for at least the first generation.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we jump into the wilderness, let's talk about the numbers aspect, because
Right.
2020 happened. Every 10 years in America, according to the Constitution, we have to take a census. And like, so what's the point of the census? Like,
Yeah. Well, think about, why do we take a census as a nation? Um, I mean, there's tax purposes, right? We need to know who to tax and how much tax we can collect. So there's finances attached to it. It also gives you a snapshot of who you're governing,
right.
and what kind of military you can put together, um, for self-defense, hopefully self-defense and not antagonistic defense.
Yeah, yeah.
um, Also, there's just the basics of, what kind of people are we governing? We took the census in 2020. We're gathering, I mean, I think they're still processing data. I don't think they have the full picture of it yet,
Yeah.
but they can do estimates, and they can take little sort of, not so much guesses, but educated guesses on what the trends will show. So like, we were taking a look earlier at Brookings Institute. They had a couple of different trends that they developed. And so like one of the things that came up in the 2020 census is that for the first time in a long time, the US has shown unprecedented stagnation in population growth.
Yeah, there's only been like a 7% growth from 10 years ago, which is lower than normal.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been a consistent, um, large uptick in population growth since the 20s, 1920s. And so, yeah, it gives the government a picture of like, what is happening and like, how do we govern a people who are not having kids, and how do we structure the economy and the military and
Yeah.
all these things, and resource our nation in a way that's appropriate. So I think, yeah, in the same way, that lends itself to what Numbers is trying to do.
Right, right. Who's in the next generation? Who was in the first generation? What happened during the wilderness? Who was lost? Who was gained?
Right.
What clans were successful? What clans were stagnant?
Right, right. And one of the things that's interesting is how Numbers begins with the census, but also with the arrangement of how the people are supposed to be organized.
Yeah,
And they encamp in a way that there's the center is the tabernacle
where God
around,
is. Yeah,
yeah, where God is and the glory of God is. And then around them, around the tabernacle is the Levites, the priestly tribe, and then around all of that are the different tribes in a sort of like, uh, I guess, a T formation. uh so that sends the message that the center,
like a cross formation.
like a cross
Yeah,
formation,
yeah,
yeah, exactly. So yeah, it sends the message that their governance will be organized around God's divine instruction, but also that who they are as a people will be dictated by that presence of God in their midst.
yeah. Absolutely. So you have these two anchor censuses, and then the wilderness. And what's this wilderness journey marked by primarily?
um
This nomadic
a
group,
lot of complaining,
a lot of whining.
a lot of whining, a lot of complaining. The wilderness is not a good look for Israel in the Old Testament. In fact, there is a lot of speculation. I mean, nobody can come down concretely on like exactly when these books were composed. Like there's, hypotheses, and people go back and forth on what sources are from what spots, and it's an endless game of people fighting with one another.
Yeah, welcome to
But one,
scholarship, everyone.
yeah, yeah, that's how people, make their money. In some cases they argue about these things, but
Yeah, they shared the fringe thing and make it mainstream, and
that's
then they
right,
bank
that's
on
right.
it, and like all the biblical scholars are like, "You're a sellout, get out of here."
Yeah, exactly. And then they cause like, ooh, like
And then the
there's
church flips
drama.
out over
Yeah,
things, and it's
exactly.
like, "Okay, everyone, calm down."
Yeah, exactly. But one hypothesis is that uh, Numbers was completed as a work either during exile or after exile, so that when Israel is reflecting on what went wrong, they look back and think about the earliest generations founding this practice of not relying on God, not trusting on God, and ignoring Him and His provisions in the wilderness. So um,
Yeah, and it's funny how like these generations always like for the rest of scripture is used as like an example of like what not to do. Like
that's
from the New
right.
Testament to the prophets to the
That's right.
psalmists, like it's like remember those whiners. Don't be like them. Don't whine. Be
That's
grateful for
right.
what God did. He freed you from Egypt. Don't complain about wanting to go back now.
Right. I'm often like fascinated by how honest and raw the biblical authors were willing to be about how much like their people group or their tribe kind of sucked. Like, I mean, you look at the disciples in the New Testament, and like they're the ones who are authorizing these works to be like circulated, and they look terrible in the Gospels. Like
Yeah, yeah.
most of the times they don't have a great look. So the same goes for the Old Testament. Like there's brutal, gruesome, dark pictures of the people of God in those stories, and somehow they got authorized as a reminder to not perpetuate those same patterns. Um, so all that's to say, yeah, the first generation especially gets some really bad looks. There's the famous story of them not relying on God's. Well, first of all, there's a story of God's provision of giving them manna. Uh,
Yeah.
if you know anything about um, the story of Exodus and through to Numbers, manna is God's provision of food for the people of God in the desert, in the wilderness. And do you remember from school what manna means in Hebrew?
No, I'm thinking of White Manor right now. It's a burger joint in New Jersey.
Is it really?
Yeah, that's what comes to mind right now. Sorry, I'm
That's
blanking
so
on all my
funny.
education and thinking of a burger.
No, I think manna in Hebrew means what is it? So like every morning, so I think it says like the first time they get it in the wilderness, they walk outside their tent and they see this white flaky stuff on the floor and they're like, "Mana, what is this?"
Hmm.
And then it just becomes manna for the rest of the time. Like it just shows up, which I think is meant to invite our reflection to think about how God's provision is always sort of like strange and curious. Like, how did I get it? I don't know. What is it? It just showed up
And
on
it's
my
kind of
doorstep.
like bread.
Yeah, it's kind of like, bro.
Yeah, so there's these provisions, but there's this like tough trek through the desert. It's not an easy trek,
Right,
and people preferred slavery over this trek because the trek is difficult.
right.
Um, and there's consequences to rebelling God, and then I mean, there's some gruesome stories where there's judgment from God
Right.
for the rebellion. One coming to mind is the outbreak of the bronze serpents, and
Mm-hmm.
and the way the poisonous serpents, these fiery snakes, would stop affecting the people is Moses was asked to raise a bronze serpent on a staff, and that would stop the attack of the poisonous snakes,
Yeah, yeah,
which is interesting because that passage is maybe an obscure passage to most people, but it's actually connected to understand one of the most famous passages of all scripture, which is John 3:16, John
mm-hmm.
chapter 3,
Mm-hmm.
because Jesus says, just like Moses lifted the snake, the Son of Man will be lifted up.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is making this reference to um, him being the one who's going to be killed to prevent death from happening.
Yeah, the means of destruction becomes the means of life.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
how
it's a pretty
vaccines work
powerful.
too, right? You have to
Yeah,
get a little bit of the
that's true.
virus to
Yeah,
defeat the virus, right?
that's true. The means of destruction become the means to life. I like that. Yeah, and I think just generally, Numbers is a really overlooked book,
Yeah.
but has a lot of payoff if you read it well into the New Testament. I mean, think about all the things that happen in the wilderness in the Gospels.
Right.
Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. John the Baptist starts the whole gospel narrative in the wilderness. Um, a lot of what Jesus's first ministry is done sort of on the outskirts of Judea. So, yeah, I mean, uh, the themes of wilderness are very present in the New Testament. Um, and really, it's because the book is all about rebellion and disobedience, but God's faithfulness and willingness to sort of plow through that the rebellion and the unfaithfulness of the people. Um, yeah, like I mean, back to that story of the manna, they get the manna, and after a while, they get sick of the manna, and they start thinking about how good they had it in Egypt, which
Yeah.
is like, really? Like, you were slaves, and you think of it from an objective standpoint. You're like, it wasn't great for you. But yeah, so it's like they get fed up with the manna, and then God gets upset with them, and there's judgment, right? Um, but he still remains with them. He still encamps with them. He still guides them and directs them along the way. So it's this strange balance of judgment, but also fidelity and God being with the people in the midst of the transition.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I find it always like, so as like a pastor who's trying to bring change within the church, not to change the message, but to use new
Mm-hmm.
innovative ways to bring changes to the changing times. I find that like people would maybe agree that change is good, but when you actually change things, people will react. And it doesn't matter the personality type. I think it's more of like there's something in all of us that likes familiarity and is scared of change, even if the change is a lot better, like a lot better.
Mm,
um so like I can relate to the people wanting to go back a little bit.
mm,
um but even the change they're heading towards is going to be a lot better.
mm.
But there's always this transitionary period of of adapting to the change is always gruesome and tough and difficult. No one likes it, even if you are for the end goal. It's always hard.
Yeah.
Like if I'm overweight, I want to change my body to be in shape. The process to get to being in shape is super gruesome,
Right, right.
even though
Well,
the
and also just like thinking about generations and how they learn the lessons from one to the next. Like,
mm-hmm.
I mean, the first generation doesn't inhabit the promised land in Numbers. Like,
Yeah,
spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, they don't
they don't
get to
make
the
it,
wilderness.
guys.
Yeah, they don't make it to the promised land, or to the land that God was leading them to. It's the generation after that gets there. Um, and so it's a sort of, you know, what was the lesson they had to learn on the way? They had to learn to sort of trust God on the journey and anticipate the good things that he had in store for them. And it was a lesson that largely was ignored.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is the important thing for us to learn from previous generations. Every generation
Right.
has a certain cultural layer to them. I mean, there's a big conversation that's always there between baby boomers and millennials.
Right.
Um, there's certain traits each generation has. Some are positive, some are negative, but it's important to like learn from the previous generations to maybe learn from the better and better things of the trait of the culture and negative things of the culture. Because each generation has a culture to it, and it's very insightful for all of us to be educated on these trends. Even if you think you're above them, you're still a
Right.
factor of them.
Right. Right. Well, and just to think about, like, how does the book work then as a whole? It's lending an example of two generations, the first generation as a warning, and the second generation from chapter 26 on as an invitation to be this kind of a, to learn from that generation how to be faithful. Um, Interestingly, the first generation had an opportunity to go to the promised land. It's not like, you know it, it's not like all those early failures exempted them from going into the promised land, but it was actually their refusal to go. Like this, they sent out spies, if you remember that story. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
in Numbers 13. But they send out spies to like sort of like scope out the land, and they come back and they're like, no, we can't take it, like it's not going to happen. And there's
Except for
only
Caleb
Joseph.
and Joseph.
Oh no, sorry, Joshua,
Joshua,
not Joseph.
Joshua.
Yeah, Joshua and Caleb are like, no, we can do it. Like God will be with us. And there's a whole riot, and that's where God finally says, like, no, you don't get to go. Like after all this, like forget it. Um,
Yeah.
but that's to say, like, it's almost as if that generation got what they wanted.
Yeah.
God gave them over
Self-fulfilling
to
prophecy.
gave them over to their sin, like Romans kind of talks about. So
Yeah.
that first generation is kind of like a warning sign, and it's used as a caution for future readers, which is how the New Testament reads it. If you go to First Corinthians, um, I think chapter 10, Paul uses the wilderness wanderings as a caution to the church to say, don't be like them. Don't,
Yeah. Yeah.
wander poorly and sort of spurn God and, you know, refuse to kind of trust his provisions and be more like the world than like Jesus.
Yeah. In many ways, that they're also the first generation because they're the first Christians to accept it. But instead of being freed from captivity of Egypt, they're freed from the captivity of Satan's sin and
Right.
death, and they're baptized into this new life. And Paul's like, "Hey, don't ruin this.
Yeah.
Remember
Yeah.
what God did for you. Don't go back to your sinful ways."
Right. 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 And I think even Hebrews does a similar thing. I think Hebrews picks up on the
Mhm.
wilderness wanderings as well. So the New Testament, again, it uses Numbers as a sort of caution or cautionary tale. Um, just like the Gospels pick up on the transition that's taking place from something old to something new.
Yeah.
Some of Paul's letters and Hebrews picks up on the cautionary use of Numbers.
Yeah.
What
One
are
of
some
my
of your like favorite things in Numbers? It's kind of a random text, so it's hard to find one that's really your favorite. But what if you could reach down in there? What's your favorite sort of part from
I think my
Numbers?
favorite part of this is like there's this random aside about Balaam, this prophet
Yeah.
who's like a pagan seer from another religion, Balaam, and he's trying to curse them. He's like a hired witch doctor. You curse the Israelites, and he can't.
Right.
And you have the talking donkey there and whatnot. So that whole thing fascinates me for multiple reasons, but mostly because it's like an aside. It's like a side plot thrown in
Right.
about non-Israelite group taking a center stage to try to um, learn from this evil that's about to befall them. But
Yeah.
God is protecting them still, even though they're rebellious. He's preventing them from being cursed, and they're reaping benefits. And then like Balaam sees a prophetic vision of the future Messiah of
Right.
for the nations through this crazy journey. Like it's already there. It's like set
Right.
up right there.
Right.
Like the prophecies to their coming Messiah to bless all the nations is in this narrative. So that's a kind of like an interesting thing because it's like it goes away from the wilderness and the census. It's just this additional bracket of
Yeah.
interesting insights.
Yeah. Yeah. The Balaam story is interesting because, like you said, it happens to the first generation. That episode takes place in the first generation. So it's this really interesting thing. Like while the people are complaining and grumbling, without them even realizing, God is protecting them from this curse that takes that's trying to be thrown on them by this Balaam character. Ultimately, at the hands of some odd named king who's trying to pay off the curse. But it's kind of it's meant to be sort of humorous, I think. Like it's meant as a foil. This is the whole thing with the donkey, right? Like the donkey's running into the angel of the Lord every couple of minutes, and it's just a strange text, but it's like meant to be like almost like poking fun at uh foreign powers and foreign kings and their ability to hurt the people of God.
Yeah. What about you? Any texts you like or find troublesome?
Yeah, it's hard for me. I guess one that's fun, one that I like in the text is that manna story. I really like the concept of um it's again there's a Sabbath worked into it. They're supposed to gather the food for 6 days. There's going to be manna every day, but on the sixth day there'll be enough for the seventh day for you to just kind of rest and not do anything. Um, so I like the way the manna is described and how it's this mysterious provision and that it's indescribable, because I think often God's provisions and care for us is like, I don't know how it happened, I don't know where it came from, but it showed up and I got what I needed, and praise God, God is good. So I like that sort of story and that phrasing, even though things do go south just a few chapters later with the manna. I also just kind of think it's funny to read their complaining. Like it's one of my favorite things to go through and read how ridiculous some of what they say sounds in the story, and then maybe have that mirror back to how ridiculous we sound sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is interesting that they're longing for slavery again after just being removed. It goes back to that statement. We've said it in three different episodes, but it was a great statement from a professor. It took a couple of days to get Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel.
Yeah.
So haunted them for years in the wilderness. Um, I think we both agreed before we went into this that a really difficult text to grapple with in Numbers is the Moses text.
Yeah, absolutely. Moses, faithful Moses, lets my people go, confronts Pharaoh, leads the people,
The
can't
hero,
speak but is bold,
the hero
doesn't get into the promised land.
doesn't get into the promised land because he taps a rock twice instead of once, apparently.
Yeah.
It's an interesting text.
Numbers
What are your
20.
first impressions, Hike?
It's hard to process it because it's like on the surface, you're like, all right, Moses just hit this rock twice. And like he's grieving all the pain of losing people. He's grieving like just being thirsty in the desert. You would think that that's like the most compassionate thing to do, give water to people who are thirsty. And then he finally listens to the people and doesn't stay focused on listening to God, and kind of like slips up in this moment of listening to the crowds versus being obedient to God. And there's different interpretations of what happened. Some say like because he used the staff and he didn't speak to the rock, he didn't pick a particular, he picked the rock that the people were wanting, not what God was leading. He hit it twice, not once. Um, he kind of does this in an act of frustration too. Well, whatever, like all these things are factoring into this moment where he hits this rock twice, and he's trying to appease the people versus listening to God.
Yeah.
And because he did that, God said, "All right, you're not going to be able to lead the promised land."
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah, it's one of those
judgment seems
stories.
harsh
Yeah,
for
exactly. Exactly. Like it's one of those stories where you're like, so what did he do wrong? Like if you read it at face
yeah,
value as a like 21st century Western reader, you're like, I don't get it.
yeah,
Like he hit the rock, he got them water. Why is he being judged so harshly? Um if you're super into learning more about this, there's a Old Testament scholar named Milgram, J. Milgram. You can look up some stuff he's written on it, but one of the things he picks up on is in the culture of the day, what Moses does looks very similar to um, like pagan practices of regions surrounding Israel, or the beginning of what would be Israel. So almost as if like Moses kind of models the like magical magician's role of like Egypt rather than the divine Yahweh role that God wants him to present. There's also the language he uses. He says, "We should we bring water out of the rock for you?" And in that "we," it seems like he's almost stepping into the role of God, and so there's potentially like a sort of idolatrous overstep from Moses. So yeah, I mean it's kind of confusing because we don't inhabit, you know, ancient Near Eastern culture anymore. But yeah, it is kind of odd the way that it takes place.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And the judgment seems severe. One slip up, and there you
yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah. Also, I mean, back to the Balaam story, the as 21st century Western readers, it sounds like an odd story, right? I mean, having a king pay off a magician or some sort of soothsayer or like person in connection with dark powers to curse another nation, like that sounds really like primitive and silly. And yet that's the world that was inhabited in that day. Like that's what you would do. That's You'd pay off somebody to curse a nation and that would win you a military victory.
Yeah, I
um,
mean, but I mean, it's not like foreign to me. Like I've prayed for people who've had curses over their lives, and breakthroughs have happened with
mm,
the power of the Spirit. Like this stuff is foreign, even, but like there are ramifications to not taking this stuff seriously.
right. Right.
Um,
It's the 21st century reader. They ignore some of the
yeah,
like sort of deeper spiritual realities that might be going on. Instead, just kind of go for some simple mechanistic explanation of things. But this is like the world of the Old Testament, this is the world ancient Israel lived in.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, if you go to Africa or some other country, this stuff is normal
right,
still. Not forget about back then. It's happening
right,
now. It happens in
right.
America. People are just don't have spiritual ears to the stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else that strikes you as sort of difficult to understand in the text?
I mean, it's just the question is it God paying retribution for the disobedience, or is it the consequence of disobeying God that
Mm,
leads to the problems? Because it's not
mm,
like God is distant in these stories. He's right in the middle of this like community. So that I always find that to be more of the case. Like God sets parameters for our sake. When we run away from them, there's consequences we'll face.
mm,
Um, so I mean that's the tension throughout. Numbers for me is okay. Is it more of God just being mean, or is there consequences to just getting out of his presence?
Right. Yeah, and even in some cases, like we said with the first generation not entering the land, it's a handing over to the thing that they want,
Yeah.
right? And how often is that the judgment we receive for what, what we have requested and asked for consistently? It's a handing over, just as that first generation was handed over to death. That's kind of the cautionary tale that rings out through the rest of the Old Testament and into the New.
Right. Right. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I think another interesting tidbit here, just to like, I can't stop preaching aspect. Joshua, who ends up leading the people to the promised land, is the same name of Jesus, Yeshua. So there's that connection there, that Jesus is going to be the one who really leads us to the promised land.
right.
Um, and
Right. In 2 episodes, we'll go to the book of Joshua, where he'll
yeah,
take the center stage as the hero. I think it's also important to recognize how Joshua, again, Joshua was a different generation. And he spoke to the older generation saying, we can do this, go with us forward. And the older generation was like, yeah, no, we can't do it. And so Joshua replaces that generation as a leader. He replaces Moses as a leader, going into the promised land. So it's interesting then to even think of Moses as potentially the older generation, I mean, not potentially, he is the older generation that perishes in the wilderness, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, and maybe too, like if I was a leader and 10 out of my 12 spies are saying don't go, we can't do it. If I was making a judgment call, like, all right, we can't do it yet. It's like the two people with the boldness to make a awful situation happen, because there's hope, there's God with us. God uses those two to kind of and do his plans. So it's
Oh,
interesting.
that was another thing too. I was thinking in the difficult to understand part, there's a lot of different places in Numbers. So if you read Numbers on your own, you're going to come across different lands and territories because it's about people traveling. And so it becomes kind of complicated. They'll run into different people groups and tribes. And one of the things that I found interesting was that almost everybody that Israel runs into on the journey back to the promised land, like everybody they run into that causes problems, they're like extended family back from Abraham.
Right, right, right.
So the Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Midianites, all these people are like long lost cousins that have developed into people groups that will, have territorial strife with Israel later on as a formal nation, but now this kind of tribal group that's moving through the land. So it's just like long, deep seated sibling rivalry that is
Cousin drama.
playing out. Yeah, cousin drama that's playing out on the pages of the Old Testament. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think we overlook that. It's
yeah,
like, oh,
like
wait a minute.
I think the Moabites are related to Lot, who is Abraham's cousin. I think the Edomites were related to like Abraham's second or third wife.
Esau,
Edomites are from Esau. Yeah. The other ones, Midianites. The Midianites are from Abraham's second wife. Ishmaelites are wandering out there in the Arab desert somewhere. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
just
yeah.
like they're all over the place. And it's just this, yeah, just deep seated rivalry amongst all of them. It's just interesting to read the
Yeah,
Old
yeah, yeah.
Testament that way.
Exactly, exactly. It's quite it's crazy to think about, like, someone's decisions affecting countries generations later.
That's right.
Like
Yeah, that's
Abraham, come
right.
on, man. Well,
That's
why
right.
did you do that? You know what? You're going to lead to this crazy battle in
Right.
200, 300, 400, 500 years from now.
Right. Well, it's interesting to think about the downer of Abraham being like blessed as the one for whom like you're going to have many nations, you're going to be the father of many nations, and then he dies and all of a sudden all the nations are like war with each other and they hate each other and they want to it's like it's such a letdown on the other end. But yeah, that's something that it's hard to understand, but when you sort of tap it back to the broader narrative of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, like it all sorts to kind of
Yeah,
the puzzle kind
connected.
of fits together.
And these 5 books are supposed to be read as like the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And we still have one more to go. So the next episode will be on Numbers, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Genesis. So Deuteronomy is next. And then we're going to revisit some of these themes because it goes through talking about stuff we've visited.
Yeah.
So we'll wrap around to some of these themes in the next crash course of the Bible. Jeremy, this is a fun conversation.
Yeah.
I hope everyone just reads Numbers, and remember it's also called In the Wilderness. I think it's a much better title to a book. But once you get through the Numbers, the census reading, it gets into a narrative form, and those censuses anchor the whole narrative from one generation to the next. So thank you all for listening. Stay caffeinated, and don't just take our word for it, but read the good word yourself. God bless you, and take care.
Take care.